The Akkadian Empire is the first territorial state in the history of the world. What does that mean? Prior to the Akkadians, the Sumerians had developed a very vibrant civilization that was based on city states. Each city controlled surrounding territory, and at one point, you may have had a city that controlled one or two more. But there was never a large territorial state throughout Mesopotamia. But the Akkadians were the first ones to consolidate their power over a vast area that went from the Mediterranean all the way to the Persian Gulf. The story of the Akkadians begins with a legend, the legend of Sargon the Great. Sargon the Great is a great ruler. He is a historical character. He actually existed. But as the founder of so many great empires, as one of the founders of one of the very first states uh, in history, Sargon's origins are surrounded with myth and legend. And over the course of the centuries, the story of Sargon the Great became the archetype, that is, the example for the stories of many other great founders of empires or religions, as you shall see later in this course. According to the legend and according to one inscription, Sargon was born to what he calls a lowly woman. And we don't know what that means. In other versions, the story states that he was married to a priestess. But in the story, he mentions, or at least whoever wrote the inscription or the other stories, mentions that this woman gave birth to a baby and placed the baby in a basket, sealed the basket with bitumen. Bitumen is a substance that is found in the Middle East. It's basically petroleum based. It's like that stuff that you put on the roof, right? That gooey black stuff, obviously to protect the basket from the waters. And this woman placed the basket along the river, and the waters took the basket along. And the basket was found by the gardener of the king of Kish. This gardener, who is not just someone who cuts flowers, the gardener obviously is someone who is in charge of the estate or the estates of the king, took the little baby, called him Sargon, and raised Sargon as his own son. Eventually, the baby becomes a powerful man. He becomes a warrior. He becomes someone upon whom the king depended. I am sure you have heard this story in a different version before. This is the story of Moses, of course. In the Hebrew Bible, the story of Moses is about a Hebrew baby who escapes the killing of babies by this horrible king. The mother places him in a basket. The basket drifts along the Nile River. An Egyptian princess rescues the baby, and he becomes a prince of Egypt until he finds out that he's not really Egyptian, that he's a Hebrew, and that his mission in life is to liberate the Hebrews from oppression from the Egyptians. The Moses story comes from a much later time, and it is obviously a retelling of the story of Sargon. Moses is not a historical character, Moses is a literary character from the Bible. And whoever wrote that story or whoever composed that story orally, the story of Moses I'm referring to, took the idea from the story of Sargon. Now, are we to believe the story of Sargon? Maybe. What is interesting about the story of Sargon is that he emphasizes that he comes from humble origins. And that's something very unusual in ancient times. In ancient times, if you want to invent a story about yourself, if you want to invent a myth about yourself, what do you say? You say, my mother was a humble woman, but some god appeared in front of her and impregnated her, and I am the son of that god. Those stories abound in many different civilizations. The story of Sargon is different because he emphasizes that he comes from below, that he was abandoned, he was discarded, and yet There was something about him. He was destined to survive, to become what? Initially, Sargon becomes the cupbearer of the king of Kish. A cupbearer is someone who serves the king, but he's not really a servant. Someone who serves the king is the person who uh, basically controls who comes close to the king. It is someone who is completely trusted by the king and therefore a very powerful man. So it seems that Sargon has become the right hand man to the king. And the next thing we know about the legend is, and then I became Sargon, the great ruler of Agade and conqueror of all of these lands. So it is interesting that we have this sequence: someone who is abandoned, someone who is rescued. He's raised in an environment of power. He becomes very close to the man who controls the city of Kish and surrounding cities, and then, without explanation, he becomes the ruler of this great empire. So, who is Sargon really, and who are these Akkadians? The Sumerians and the Akkadians had a relationship for many years. The Sumerians were the founders of this great civilization in Mesopotamia, and you see in this image on the left. The Akkadians were warriors, most likely nomadic warriors, and they came from a completely different group. They were part of the Semitic tribes that lived in and around Mesopotamia. So linguistically, they were very different from the Sumerians. Obviously, they had close contact with them. And what some historians believe is that the first contact between the Sumerians and the Akkadians was a violent one. The Akkadians were attracted to civilization, the Akkadians were attracted to what the Sumerians had to offer, and most likely they attacked them. But as it has happened many times in history, the confrontation between civilized peoples and barbarians usually leads to some type of arrangement. And it seems that after a while, these Akkadians were no longer enemies of the Sumerians, but they were employed as mercenaries by them. What is a mercenary? A mercenary is someone who fights for money. The Sumerians, who had become powerful and wealthy, probably saw it as something convenient to hire Akkadians to fight their wars. And as the Akkadians settled, along with their families and animals and herds, inside or close to Sumerian cities, they began to appropriate the trappings of civilization. They became civilized. At one point, however, Sargon, who most likely was a commander working for either the king of Kish or another city, decided that why should he be the man behind the power? Why shouldn't he be the power himself? So most likely, Sargon, who probably had a humble origin, like the legend says, decided that it was time for him to take control. He overthrew the king, and then he started to conquer these other kingdoms, these other cities. And after conquering all of the Mesopotamian cities, so all of the Sumerian cities in Mesopotamia, he went beyond that, and he attacked the cities to the north and west, and he reached the Mediterranean Sea. And then he went south and he reached the shores of the Persian Gulf. And it is speculated that he may have conquered even lands as far as Bahrain, which is an island of the Arabian Peninsula today. And what does conquest mean? Does it mean that he conquered the cities and he occupied them? Probably not. Most likely, when the Akkadians conquered the cities, they either left the old kings behind or they established new kings. And every year they had to pay tribute, grain, animals, gold, precious objects, weapons, and perhaps also they had to contribute men to the armies of Sargon. So Sargon is extremely important because he is the ruler of the first large territorial state in history. He is the ruler of the first empire in history, an empire that was composed of Sumerians, Akkadians, and many other groups. Some of them speaking the same language, others speaking very different languages and with very different traditions. The kingdom or the empire of Sargon continued to expand, and it reached its highest point with Naram Sin. Naram Sin was the grandson of Sargon the Great. And what you see here is the stele or stela, which is a carved rock that portrays Naram Sin as a great conqueror vanquishing his. So, what happened to the great empire of Sargon and his descendants? After about 150 years, the area of Mesopotamia was attacked by the Gutians. The Gutians were a people from the east in what today is Iran. We don't know much about them. What we do know is that they spoke a language that was different from Sumerian and it was not a Semitic language. So their origins are very obscure. And they developed writing, and you can see a tablet right here where they produce writing. And thanks to these tablets, we know that the Gutians had a very distinct origin. So under this Gutian incursion, the third dynasty of Ur represents a re-establishment of a Sumerian dynasty in Mesopotamia. As you can see in this map, the brown area is the area of this territorial state, and most likely they control the surrounding areas through tribute. The third dynasty of Ur is a revival of Sumerian civilization. During this time, we see a lot of activity from the cultural perspective. You see the production of new texts, the compilation of earlier accounts, and it is a period of prosperity. The founder of the third dynasty of Ur was Ur-Nammu. Ur-Nammu defeated the Gutians, and he established a very prosperous kingdom. In some of the inscriptions that we find about Ur-Nammu, he is remembered not as a great warrior, but as a builder, someone who brought water, meaning what? That he rebuilt. Ur-Nammu is also famous because he produced one of the oldest codes of law. And this is very important. For thousands of years now, we're talking about the year 2100, 2000 BC. For thousands of years, there has been civilization in Mesopotamia. And yet, the law had not been written systematically. Writing had existed since the year 30. The third dynasty of Ur came to an end after the incursions of the Elamites. The Elamites were people from, again, modern day Iran, just to the east of Mesopotamia. The Elamites produced a Elamites were displaced by the Amorites. The Amorites were a Semitic tribe. Now, who are these Semites that you keep hearing about? The term Semitic is a linguistic term. It applies to individuals who speak Semitic languages. Today, the only Semitic languages left in the world are Arabic, spoken by. Among the cities that the Amorites built was Babylon, probably around the year 1800 BC. And Babylon is one of those almost mythical cities. It was the center. If you look at this chart, these are different